Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Tita, and I'm the Program Associate with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today for the Whole Farm Sustainable Pest Management course. This is the seventh lesson of 12, and our mission is to promote a healthy, vibrant agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. And we will bring wild nature back to farms. Just a reminder that all participants are muted. If you're experiencing any technical issues, there are moderators in the chat to help. And feel free to use the chat to ask questions in the chat for the presenters. Our 2050 vision is to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms, the hedgerows of habitat to the length of the moon and back to help support all different kinds of beneficials on the farm and restoring riparian areas because they're the lifeblood of the landscape. And we really believe that avian pest control is part of that toolbox for managing crops. We're excited to announce that participants can now sign up for our Sustainable Pest Management listserv that will launch sometime before the end of the year. You'll be able to connect with others about sustainable pest management and learn about in-person online learning events, research, books, journal articles, publications, videos, and other pieces of knowledge related to sustainable pest management. And for those of you who are still looking for DPR credits, we now have a natural enemies habitat course that is made up of a mixture of previous webinar recordings from the Sustainable Pest Management course, as well as our produced videos featuring farms and researchers. This course is on demand and can be taken over several days if needed, and it's worth 2.5 CE credits through DPR. And you can find this on the Wild Farm Alliance's online course page. Today's webinar is coexisting with and supporting beneficial birds and bats with Austin Spence from UC Davis and Rachel Long with the UC Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor Emeritus. Our next webinar will be the Plant Health Fosters Pest Suppression, and that'll be on January 14th with Miguel Altieri, who is the co-director of the Centro Latina Americano de Investigaciones Agroecologiques, and Amelia Godin, the associate professor and endowed chair at the Department of Plant Science at UC Davis. And definitely consider checking out all the rest of the lessons in the series. They occur about every 2 weeks through March. If you missed one, the earlier ones have been really great, and the recordings are all up on our website under the online courses at wildfarmalliance.org. And we have continuing education credits available from DPR and ASA. And I'm going to pass this off to Austin next. And just as a final reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you're having any issues. And I'll let you take it away, Austin.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Austin. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Davis, with Danny Karp. He's a kind of a big bird sustainable agriculture researcher here. And so I'm helping out with a big project that I'll kind of get into in my talk, but I kind of wanted to talk to you generally about birds and then kind of get into some of the specifics that I think would be helpful for kind of generally helpful for thinking about birds on farms. And so I kind of want to start off with my learning objectives, thinking about what I want you to take away from this talk. And one of the first big thing is that birds are generally low risk, and I want you to think about why that is. And so they can provide these pest control management benefits without being a food safety risk. And that's a lot of what our lab thinks of, thinking about how birds might be spreading food safety pathogens into agricultural lands. And then the second thing I want you to be able to do is share with other growers what they should do if they find bird feces in the field, and then how they can still support avian pest control through nest boxes and habitat despite avian feces. And so I think hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be able to kind of answer these two big main questions that I think will be helpful and pretty generalizable for whatever kind of farm you're working with. And so I kind of want to take a step back really quick and think about birds in agriculture generally. This is this is a bird called a common quail, and it's native to Egypt. And this is actually one of the first, historically, the first birds that humans have written about that have bothered farmers. And so this bird was common along grain fields along the Nile. Um, and so you can think about it like 4,500 years ago, farmers were already thinking about birds in their habitat. They were worried about birds eating their seeds. And you can flash forward to California about halfway around the world, several thousand years later, and we still have quail on our farm. So this is a picture of a California quail on a farm in the Central Coast, a kale farm. And so we clearly haven't solved this problem. We can't exclude all birds from farms. Birds they can fly easily, they're protected by federal laws. And so rather than trying to just exclude birds, I think what our lab is trying to take an approach to is thinking about how we can coexist with them, both as pest management, and then also think of them, try to reduce the risk of the human safety risk aspects of their biology. And so that kind of leads us to this fact that birds can provide multiple ecosystem services at once. And hopefully this is kind of one of the big takeaways from when we think about birds, but we can take this hawk, for instance, and if we're on a strawberry farm, we can think of the hawk being beneficial, taking out a pest bird like a starling or a robin. So these hawks are eating these pest birds, they're reducing the pests, but and then we can think about something like a swallow that might be eating a pest insect. And so these birds can provide positive pest control services. But in the same vein, this hawk might also eat a good pest control bird, or this bird might eat a good insect, an intraguild predation insect, so an insect that's eating other insects. Additionally, these birds might be consuming the crop directly, or they might produce fecal contamination. And so when we think about birds in these farm ecosystems, we're really thinking about kind of the entirety of this plot, and we want to try to increase these benefits while decreasing the costs. And I'm going to be today talking about fecal contamination, but I really think that this you'll see that it kind of extends to pest control through bird boxes and insect pest control as well. So when we're thinking about contamination with birds, food contamination, we're really thinking about three main pathogens. So we're thinking about E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter. And all three of these kind of cause the same thing, like intestinal problems, diarrhea. And you've probably seen the news. Every time I give some sort of talk about this, I just look up E. coli outbreaks this month. And just in December, we've had E. coli outbreaks in vegetables, an unknown source of E. coli, Salmonella outbreaks in cucumbers, and Campylobacter in milk. And so a lot of these growers are worried, and you probably know this, about introduction of these pathogens into their farms. And the hard thing is that tracing can be pretty difficult. So on these farms, we can have mammals close by, like feedlots, wild mammals like coyotes, or domesticated mammals like cats in the field. We can have human activity and birds. And so figuring out where these pathogens might come from can be pretty difficult. And so what our lab has been trying to do is focus in on these birds and make a more holistic assessment of, are these birds actually posing a risk? Do growers have to worry about it? And I'll say right off the bat, in all of our time tracking food, like through the CDC, through the FDA, we've only ever found a single instance of pathogens traced back to actual birds. And this was in a sandhill crane population in Alaska. And so what our lab thought is, this seems to be pretty uncommon. If all of the food outbreaks, it's only ever been traced back once to this Alaskan pea field, what is the risk of actual birds in these agricultural settings? And so to do that, we have to think about what the spillover cycle, the pathogen spillover cycle actually means. So we can take this killdeer as an example. And we can first ask, does the bird carry the pathogen? If it doesn't, then it's not a food safety risk, right? If it doesn't have a pathogen, we don't have to worry about birds. If it does the bird actually use the farm habitat? If it doesn't, again, it's not a food safety risk. But we know these killdeers do use farm habitats. You might have seen them on your farms or farms you've worked on. And so we know that. Finally, does the pathogen survive in the fecal sample through harvest? So in E. coli or Salmonella pathogen has to actually live in that fecal sample through harvest. If it doesn't, it's not a food safety risk. But if it does, and it fulfills all three of these requirements, then that is a true food safety risk. So what we wanted to do was first ask which farm birds are likely to carry zoonotic pathogens, which birds are using leafy green farms. We're focusing on fresh produce because it doesn't go through a kill stage. And in California, a lot of that produce is leafy greens. And then how long do pathogens survive in avian fecal samples? So what we did was we searched the literature and found 15 studies that looked at birds on produce farms, over 16,000 tests. And we found that pathogens are actually pretty rare. So E. coli was only found in 0.1% of the samples. Salmonella also 0.6%. Campylobacter was a little bit more common, but overall, we're seeing less than 10% of birds have any sort of pathogens at all. And for these more dangerous ones like E. coli and Salmonella, it's less than 1%. Interestingly, if we look at this map of where the tests are occurring, we're seeing a lot of this testing out on the West Coast. And so if any of you farmers or growers know anybody in the central or eastern United States, we'd love to get some data from you, work with your farms. But what this means is that pathogens are rare in birds. It's not like we're seeing them very often. We can kind of look at the traits that if we know which birds have the pathogens, we can look at the traits associated with it. And so for Campylobacter, we see that larger birds are actually more likely to have these pathogens. And we think that that's because larger birds live longer. They can pick up these pathogens in a lot more places. And so we can start to say, okay, these risks aren't the same among species. We can talk to growers and look at, hey, these larger birds might be a risk, but a smaller bird on your farm, like a bird in a nest box, is actually not a huge risk food safety wise. Next, which we were really excited about this, is we looked at if birds lived in nest boxes or not, and if they were invasive or not. And we found that native nest box birds, these birds that are great at acting as pest control services, rarely ever have pathogens, whereas these invasive nest box birds, we're thinking house sparrows and European starlings, are more likely to have pathogens than their native counterparts. And the other nest types, we're kind of seeing a mix, but I wanted to focus really on these nest box types. And so these native species almost never have pathogens. In fact, the three most common in California that we work with, Western bluebird, tree swallow, and northern house wren, we've never seen a single pathogen in them ever. So out of the hundreds of tests that we've done, we haven't seen a pathogen. And so what that means is growers can put out these nest boxes and have these birds for pest control services, really without any worry of spreading any pathogens or human health risk. And so that was great news. We're super excited about this. We're getting this submitted already, and we're working with growers to kind of spread the word about this. So yeah, fantastic news. The other great news is we can think about management to help these nest boxes out. So we know that European starling and house sparrows have these pathogens more than their native counterparts. And so we can limit entrance holes, so stop them in their tracks before they can even use the nest boxes, and then check the nest boxes and evacuate invasive species. And I'm sure that Wildfire Alliance has shared this a bunch, but there's a bunch of resources out there on how you can do this, how to make the nest boxes correctly so that you limit, especially European starling, from using these nest boxes at all. So next, we now know that birds don't carry pathogens that often, But we wanted to say, okay, let's say there is a, a fecal sample on the lettuce. Like this still happens. Birds are out on these farms, they're pooping on produce. How long is that fecal sample going to survive? Because if it doesn't survive very long, then we really don't have much to worry about. And so what we did was we conducted an experiment where we grew E. coli in the lab. We put E. coli in a certain, we collected fecal samples and put a certain amount of E. coli in the fecal samples, and then we put it out on the field and we left it there for a certain amount of days. We used, for this experiment, we used two different birds, a small bird and a large bird. And then we kind of separated their fecal samples out into different sizes so we could test, does species matter? Is it the size of the fecal sample that matters? We put it on three common substrates, so lettuce, soil, and plastic. And then we left it there from 1 to 30 days and collected it. We saw how much E. coli was left. And what we found is that the substrate that the fecal sample is on is very important. So we had higher E. coli survival on lettuce than plastic. That's this green line versus the pink line. But all in all, as time went on, E. coli didn't survive very long. And so this is kind of what we expected, but it's great news to see it out in the data. But more importantly, and we think that these substrate differences are because we have microclimate differences between temperature and humidity between lettuce and plastic. But more importantly, we found that these different fecal attributes, particularly fecal mass, was much more important in predicting E. coli survival. So these large fecal samples from turkeys, 4.75 grams, E. coli survived much longer, even after 30 days, than these small fecal samples that we would see commonly from a Western bluebird or like a sparrow. So we know that E. coli survived longer on lettuce than plastic or soil, but they survived much longer in these larger fecal samples, and that species didn't actually matter. It's really just the size of the fecal samples. And this is great news because that means when we're harvesting or growers are going out and checking their fields, if there's a large fecal sample, just don't harvest around it. If there's a fecal sample on lettuce, don't harvest that piece of lettuce. But a small fecal sample on a sprinkler or a small fecal sample on a piece of plastic, probably not a huge deal when we're thinking about food safety. And so this is great news again for these insectivorous birds like a Western bluebird that has these small fecal samples. They don't particularly interact with lettuce very much. I don't have much, I talked a little bit too much, but we did another experiment looking at 5 or 10 different species because we wanted to check, does species really not matter? And we did it just on lettuce in the lab with these 10 different species. And we found, like the previous experiment, that the size of the fecal sample matters a lot. So if we're looking at turkey and Canada goose, we see a lot of E. coli left. But if we're looking at these other smaller birds, even just after 3 days, we see about 1% or less E. coli left. And this is the reason this is so exciting is because fecal sample size corresponds directly with how big the bird is. And so we don't need growers or farm workers to understand, to be able to identify which bird species. If it's a big bird, that bird is a little bit riskier than a small bird that's something like living in a nest box. So what does this mean for farms? So we went out and sampled leafy green farms to look at how much poop there was actually on the farm. We did 2,700 meter plots and just looked at all those plots for fecal samples. We only found 324 fecal samples, and almost all of those were on soil. And we know that soil, the bacteria died a lot quicker than on lettuce. The current guidance right now, at least for leafy green farms, is that we don't harvest a meter within that soil, a meter around that fecal sample if it's on lettuce or on soil. And so what that would mean for current guidance is if farmers and growers followed this exactly, we would predict around a 12% loss of the yield. But from our work, we know that we went out and looked at different birds in the field, and we know that 81% of birds found in leafy green fields are less than 100 grams. So they're small. Most birds are small. Most of the fecal samples were on soil. And so if you only don't harvest around large fecal samples and only don't harvest for fecal samples on lettuce, our new guidance would be only about 3% loss. And so we can kind of update these guidances for dealing with bird fecal samples to really incorporate that science. We know that E. coli survives on lettuce and E. coli survives in large fecal samples. Those are the two most important things. So hopefully, you can, now that we're kind of at the end of the talk, you can explain why birds are a low food safety risk. They don't have them very often. And then why these nest boxes are still really important. Um, and like I said, birds don't have them very often. Larger species and invasive species are more risky. And so we can deal with those species specifically instead of thinking of birds as kind of this monolith. And then most birds found on leafy green farms are really small. So they're small, so their poop is small. And so it's a low food safety risk. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Well, I guess we'll have a little quiz.
Yeah, thanks so much, Austin. That was great. We're going to launch the poll questions. And if you have any questions for Austin, you can definitely put those in the chat. So those are popped up now. We'll give people a minute to read through and answer those.
Yeah, and then I guess we can go over the results. So which birds are the lowest food safety risk? Yep, and it looks like most people got it. It's insectivorous nest box birds. So these birds are small, so they have really small fecal samples. And then we have never found, at least in the Western species, with our work, we've never found a northern house wren, a Western bluebird, or tree swallows with any of the three main pathogens. So they are a really low food safety risk, and those are kind of the birds that would use nest boxes. So that's great news. And then for the second question, which birds should be prevented from using nest boxes? Yep, and it looks like most people got it here too. Invasive species. Invasive species like European starling and house sparrow were more likely to have pathogens. Um, so that means we can use these nest boxes, and if we use them correctly, we still have a low food safety risk. And so some people said carnivorous species, and what we do have actually nest boxes for some carnivorous species like barn owl and American kestrel. We also didn't find that they had pathogens very often, so they aren't a food safety risk either. So that's great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Austin. I'm going to hand it over to Rachel, and we'll come back. If you have more questions for Austin, throw them in the chat, and we'll come back to them at the end of the session. Thanks.
So, gosh, we're going to move from birds onto bats, and so my talk is going to focus a little bit about the biology of bats, the work that I did on bats and pest control, and then finish up talking about bat houses. So this here is it's a pallid bat. It's a gosh, the size of say a robin in terms of wingspan, but of course much smaller body. And the pallid bat became our California state bat last year, joining other iconic wildlife like the California quail. And this bat here has a cricket in its mouth that it's going to carry to its roost. Bats are mammals. They're the only mammal that's capable of true flight. And if you look at its wings, there's actually it has like a thumb and then four fingers that are surrounded by this incredible membrane that allows them this to be incredibly agile in flight. And if you see all those striations, a lot of those are muscles that allow those wings to contract and expand. And so they're just really amazing agile flyers at night. Let's see. Okay. So a lot of people think of, or many people think of bats as like flying rats, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. Bats are actually more closely related to primates than they are to rats. And if you take a look at the skeleton of a bat, again, you can see that, the hands there, the thumb and the four fingers, and that, connected by the wing membrane, just gives them this incredible ability for flight. So this is a maternity colony, and on the right, what you're looking at is a lot of little baby bats. They're called pups. They're born without any hair, and there's a mother sitting there. On the left, it's actually a mother and a newborn baby. As I say, they're born without any hair. And the mother actually will take care of her young for about maybe 3 to 5 months. They only have one offspring a year, so they don't reproduce that fast at all. And it takes about 5 weeks for the babies to be able to fly. And what's amazing is these little bats actually live anywhere from about 15 to up to 30 years. The males in these colony forming bats, like these are Mexican free-tailed bats, but the males are generally roosting either individually or in smaller groups. But if you have a colony, then it's mothers and their young. So bats in the United States, in our area, are insectivorous. They only feed on insects. They catch their prey primarily on the wing, like on the left-hand side. There's a Mexican free-tailed bat that's chasing a moth. And they both navigate and catch their prey by echolocation, which is essentially the use of sound waves. They normally, catch their prey on the wing, but sometimes they can land on the ground and catch prey, like this amazing pallid bat, again, our state bat that's feasting on a scorpion on the lower right. But bats also have really good eyesight. So the blind as a bat is actually a myth, and they use their eyesight when hunting for prey sometimes. So we don't see bats, but they actually are all around us. They're just hidden and active at night, and so we hardly see them. But you find them everywhere: rocky crevices, caves, of course, buildings, old barns, tree hollows. And increasingly, we're finding that bats are using bridges as well, and they're roosting in the expansion joints underneath the road base. So this is actually the Yolo Causeway in between Sacramento and Davis. And in the summertime, in the evenings, you can watch the Mexican free-tailed bats that are roosting in that causeway. You can watch them emerge in the evening and see really these great plumes of bats coming out of their roost. And what's really neat is that you can actually pick up these bat emergences with Doppler radar. So they look like a hailstorm, with these bats coming out. There's probably 300,000 bats in the causeway here. And and so this is a graphic of the bats emerging from the causeway, where you see it's all lit up by a Christmas tree. That indicates, the huge numbers of bats that are coming out. Again, this is Doppler radar, and then spreading out all through the bypass, north and south, and in the area. And there's a grad student from UC Santa Barbara, Brian Lee, who put this graphic together, and he's really interested in looking at whether the Mexican free-tailed bats shown here on the right, whether they're foraging over rice fields and helping to control the armyworm. So he's looking at correlations between the bat activity and pheromone trap catches for armyworm control in rice fields. So it's just really interesting that you can actually map the patterns of bat activity over large landscapes. So we have 26 or 25 species of bats in California. Some of my favorites are the hoary bat on the left and the red bat on the right. These are actually solitary bats that roost more in trees. And if you're interested in knowing about the bats in your area, that you can actually get these little devices for your cell phone called these ecometers. Or echo meters, I'm sorry. And these echo meters actually pick up the high frequency calls of bats, and then they tell you what species of bat is foraging in the area. So, for example, the red bats have a pretty high echolocation call and relative to the hoary bats that are more down in the audible range. But anyways, these echometers are just really fun to use right on your phone to digitize these calls and identify the bats that are in your area. So this is the big brown bat, another fairly common bat in California. And oftentimes you know that you have a colony of bats by all the guano or fecal pellets that are left behind. And so this is just an example of the guano. And guano is actually good in the sense that it's also a good fertilizer because of the high nitrogen in this the fecal matter. And so oftentimes you know that you have a colony just by the guano that you see on the ground. But you can also hear bats. If you disturb them, they will make some chirping noise, so you know that they're there. Once in a while, you might see like a big pile of guano on the ground, but then you never see any bats. And that's an indication of a night roost. So you have day roosts where the bats are living during the day, they're sleeping in these maternity colonies. And then at night, they come out and feed, but they can't fly for a total of like 8 hours straight. They need to rest. And so oftentimes they find any sort of like front porch or overhang where the males and the females actually then will come together and socialize, and they'll digest their food and leave lots of gifts on the front of your porch, and then leave before daybreak. So you look and you go, gosh, I've got all these piles of guano, but I never see any bats. And the reason why is because it's probably a night roost. So bats tend to be either migratory, like the Mexican free-tailed bats here in California, and they'll go south for the winter where there's a year-round food source, and then they come back every year in the springtime to where they were born. So they have incredible homing instincts, just like salmon, for example. Other bats in much colder climates will hibernate, and they'll go into caves and lower their body temperature right above freezing, and then spend the winter just in this torpor state. So the bottom picture is of a cave with a number of bats that are in that area. And unfortunately, there's a new fungus that came in. It's been about 15 years now, called white nose syndrome that grows on the bat's skin and that are hibernating and wakes them up, and then they don't have enough fat tissue to survive for the rest of the winter. So this fungus has really resulted in the loss of just millions of bats. It's very sad, but I'll talk just a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk. A lot of my work early on focused on looking at the value of bats for helping to control pests on farms. And you can tell what bats are feeding on by looking at their guano or fecal pellets. That bats cannot digest insect exoskeleton. So what passes through are legs and wings and antennae, and you can often identify then those insects down to a species level, just by looking under a microscope. And of course now they have DNA tests for assessing the bat guano and the types of insects that bats are feeding on. But we collected guano from known roosts. This is in Woodland. Where a farmer just put up a board, and the bats like that area, and you can just see all the guano beneath that roost. So we collected guano from a couple of known roosts and looked at the percentage of different insects in the bat diet. And so just wanted to draw your attention to this figure, which is the percent volume of different insects in the guano samples from April to September. And I just wanted you to focus on the darker blue because that's the percentage of moths that are in the bat diet. And as you can see, by September, 70% of the diet of bats is moths. And moths, of course, are a major pest. The adults lay eggs and the eggs hatch, and then you get larvae like this tomato fruitworm that causes the damage to extensive damage to crops. And what was interesting as a side is that we hardly found any beneficial insects in the bat guano samples. And the reason why is that a lot of beneficial insects, in fact, most of them are active during the day, like our ladybird beetles here feeding on aphids, and bats are nocturnal. And those insects that are predators, like the green lacewing, that forage at night, actually have bat detectors on their wings. And so when they detect an echolocation, they'll just fold their wings and drop to the ground to avoid being predated. And there's a really nice paper from the 1970s by a researcher who actually did these studies showing that lacewings can detect bats and avoid predation. So one of the projects that we worked on was to look at the impact that bats might have on helping to control codling moth in walnut orchards. This is also a pest of apples and pears, but we were interested in knowing whether the bats were actually feeding on the adult moths and then helping to prevent egg laying and subsequent infestations by the codling moth larvae. So we actually went out in the field and we trapped bats, of course, having all the permits from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's hard to catch bats, because they echolocate and they can just zip around your net. But we did manage to catch quite a few bats. They're hard to get out of the nets. Boy, never pick up a bat ever because they fight like Tasmanian devils, and you will be bitten if you're not careful with only picking up bats if you have gloves on. But anyways, the results of our study showed that about 10% of the bats that we captured did eat codling moth. So we know that they are actually feeding on this insect pests. And then the bats were essentially protecting about 6% of the crop from codling moth damage in this one particular orchard, walnut orchard where we worked, showing that bats, really can have an impact on helping to manage crop pests. We didn't see any reduction in pesticide use, but there was a really interesting study that just recently came out in Science, and the researcher did a lot of work on pesticide use and bat die-off from this white nose syndrome, and found that farmers actually increased their insecticide use by 31% as a result of this tremendous loss of bats from the white nose syndrome. And along with that, you had some huge health issues with pesticide use. So what it shows is that that biodiversity is just so incredibly important for a healthy world, and bats play an important role for pest control as well. So just to finish up a little bit about bats and bat houses. These are bat houses up on a barn, and they're like bird houses, only the opening is underneath. And I like that they're self-cleaning. If you take a look up into an occupied house, then you can often see these little bats that are looking down back at you. We found that actually location is incredibly important for where to place the bat houses for maximum occupancy. That bats love morning sun and afternoon shade. They're mammals. We all enjoy that. They need to be mounted on structures. Poles seldom work because I think they cool down too much at night. For the mothers to leave the bat babies, and structures buffer those temperature fluctuations. Trees never work because predators like raccoons can get to the bats. They need to be within a quarter mile of water. Bats drink on the wing, and they need to be at least 10 feet off the ground. And the reason why is because when bats go into these houses, they don't just fly in, they actually drop down and then they swoop straight up like a rocket, flip upside down and crawl in feet first. And so if you have, say, a couple of hundred bats that might be trying to get into these houses, they need a lot of room for maneuvering into their homes. Uh, Half the calls I get are how do I get bats? The other half of the calls that I get are how do I get rid of bats? And so this is how you exclude bats. Just, you can put netting over the whole. You can find out where the bats are getting in and out of structures by sitting outside on a lawn chair in the evening and watching their emergence. But do not exclude the bats between May and August when they have pups, because then the mothers won't be able to get back in to feed their young. And lastly, just wanted to share that about rabies. It's very rare and it is preventable. So less than 1% of bats carry rabies and lower than other wild animals. The key is never pick up or handle a bat with bare hands. Vaccinate your pets. Most rabies comes from dog bites, and if bitten, certainly seek medical attention. So bats might look cute, like this Townsend's big-eared bat that we have in California, but never touch them, and that will certainly help prevent rabies. So great resources for bats include Bat Conservation International and Northern California Bats that does bat rescue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This was great. Let's launch our second set of questions.
Good. I like that everybody's saying that bats feed on insects. They do not. We don't have any vampires here, and so good to know that that's extremely beneficial.
Perfect. Do you want to talk about the second question?
So bats do primarily feed on insects. It's good to see everybody got that. And then the favorite prey are moths. They do eat. They're generalist predators, but I think they really like the moths in particular because they're soft-bodied, and then if they're gravid, that is full of eggs, they just have a super high energy source. So moths would be the correct answer there. Thank you.
Great.
And other, and down in the desert Southwest, like down by Arizona and down into Mexico, that the pallid bat is in that area, and they will switch to feeding on sometimes on pollen and nectar, and even the hummingbird feeders. You'll find some bats in the desert Southwest that'll feed on pollen and nectar, but in our area they're only feeding on insects.
Cool.
A fun little fact, just because I used to study hummingbirds, they also feed on insects too. So the pollen and nectar is never a good source of protein. So anything that feeds on that also has to eat insects. So bats and hummingbirds alike kind of they love getting their protein from insects.
Interesting.
I think Jim is asking about how about pollination? Do bats provide any pollination services?
In the desert Southwest, bats can help with pollinating plants in the wild, but here in most of the U.S. they're all insectivorous. But yes, in the desert Southwest, they're important pollinators of particularly of cacti, like the saguaro cacti.
Nice. Seeing too many questions here. So are bat boxes good for all species, or are there species specific bat boxes?
So that's a good question. That the bat boxes are for colony forming bats. So some bats they just are roosting solitary, and but the bat boxes would be for the colony forming bats, like the Mexican free-tailed bats, the pallid bat that just became our state bat last year, the little myotis, little brown bats, and the big brown bats. So those are the primary bats that you'd see using the bat houses, where the red bats and the hoary bats are more living alone and independently in trees, and so you won't find them there. Mhm.
Great. And there's a question from Julia for Austin about any knowledge about pigeon feces having pathogens.
Yeah, so I mean, a great question. Pigeons are a little bit strange because we see them in both urban and agricultural settings. In agricultural settings, there actually hasn't been a ton of work, but the thing is, um, because we know that larger species have pathogens more often, and pigeons are a pretty large species, like um, out of the range of birds that you're having on your farm, they're pretty big. And so I would say they're probably more likely to have pathogens. And so because we know that they're larger, we can kind of take steps to exclude them without excluding like nest box species. And so um, kind of a nice thing. Oh, you run a school farm. I mean, I think if your pigeons are safe and I don't know. I wouldn't say you have to exclude everything. We work with fecal samples a lot. And so if you see a pigeon fecal sample, don't harvest around that. But we're not going to exclude all birds all the time. So I don't think you have to feel bad about it. Definitely. I love them too. So
So a question came up about how is it that bats are important pollinators for saguaros when they feed so heavily on insects? Bats, there's just a few species that are pretty opportunistic and like hummingbirds, feeding on insects. Some bats actually can switch and feed on pollen and nectar, and even sometimes the saguaro fruit that they'll feed on. So they're pretty opportunistic, and not all bats, but there are some species that will feed on nectar and pollen as well as insects, but not in our area in Northern California, or excuse me, in California, just only down in the desert Southwest.
What would be the best way to exclude the pigeons if you needed to exclude them? I'm just curious.
I mean, I think with pigeons, it's thinking about where they're roosting. So similar to what Rachel was saying, if there's big roosting areas, the best way to exclude any bird is with netting. But I think the nice thing about what our work has shown is that because even large birds have pathogens so infrequently, like they rarely have E. coli, they rarely have salmonella, we can instead think about managing the farm. So if there's fecal samples on the produce, don't harvest that. But we don't actually have to worry too much about them being around.
There's a question here on the estimation of the contribution of bird feces and bats to crops in terms of nutrients like N and P. Like bat guano and bird guano is certainly used as a fertilizer, and they are good sources of N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, so those those. Of course, the guano from both birds and bats is nutritious for crops. You don't want to. That doesn't mean that you want raw bat guano and manure out there. I mean, you're talking about fertilizer sources for applying it at the proper time to ensure that there are no problems. We're not talking about raw. We're talking about like packaged fertilizers. So
yeah, my guess would be if
Mhm.
from wild sources, it's probably very little. Like
Mhm.
I don't know what you think, Rachel, but I know that birds probably aren't providing any large source of wild nutrients.
No, and neither for bats. I mean, the bats are, they're not, there's just not, enough of them to flying over crops to be a huge issue. It's where you collect the guano where they're roosting, and that's where you have the biggest source of guano, and that's where, of course, it's often mined for fertilizer use.
There's a question about any estimates on the numbers of insects a single bat might eat in a season?
Yeah, the bats are eating their body weight or more in insects every night. So if you can imagine eating, like 100 pounds of pizza a night, that's a lot of insects that they feed on.
Nice.
And pathogens being spread by bat guano, not that I've ever heard of. I guess the most of just never heard of a issue with bat guano on food pathogens.
Yeah, and I could chime in. I've also never heard of it. I think the biggest worry, really, I mean, the reason were a worry is because they're really visible and you see them out in the field all the time. I think Rachel made a great point as we often don't see bats, even though they're out at night a lot. But I think the biggest worry really for pathogens is pigs and cows. It's livestock. It's not these small insectivorous animals.
Excellent. Oh, we will put the link for this week's evaluation in the chat here momentarily. There's a question about if you install X number of bat boxes in a given location, is it likely they will all be inhabited?
Yeah, the more bat boxes that you put up, the more bats that you can get. They're not, competitive at all. But just the key is to make sure that you put it in the right location with that morning sun and afternoon shade, and up at least 10 feet, and on a structure. But do when you put up a bat house, really do pay attention to where you're putting that house. I mean, that you wouldn't want to put it up like in an area where there's lots of little kids, that might come in contact with the bat. That 1 in 1,000 will have rabies, and when a bat falls out of a house, it gets paralyzed. But that said, you really have to pay attention to where you put the houses so that they're in a protected area where kids and pets wouldn't be able to get in a close contact with any bats. So barns are not, and I don't recommend putting bat houses on your personal house or your home, because just too many people and kids in the area. And then also just know that when you put up a house, that the bats will urinate and defecate when they go in and out of a house. And so if you have it like on your own personal home, then you're going to have your whole wall that's going to be covered with bat guano and bat urine that wouldn't smell very good. So I like to recommend putting up houses out on farms and shops, places where nobody's going to come in contact with any of the bats.
Awesome. There's a question about, does it take much time for bats to find and inhabit the boxes?
So if it's in the right place, that they'll find it and use it. Sometimes it'll take a couple of years before a bat house is occupied. Sometimes bat houses are used right away, and it's often because they're excluded from a roost site that they used to use. Other times, bats reproduce really slowly, so you might have a few bats that'll use the house, and then it might take 10 to 15 years to get up to a sizable colony of 100 or so bats. So it's either that they're occupied right away because they've lost their roost site, or that it takes years for the population to build up to a sizable number, 10 to 15 years to get a couple hundred bats. And if it's not used within like 3 or 4 years, then it's in the wrong place, the bats. And you don't have to worry about bats invading, your house or your shop if you have a bat house up, because if they liked it, they would already be there.
Great. And there's a couple of questions in the chat about if bat boxes are not certified by the Conservation International, is that an issue?
No, that there's many different types of bat houses that can be used. You could even just, get a board and put it up with like a half-inch spacing. If you go bigger than a half-inch to half-inch to 3/4 of an inch. If you go bigger than 3/4 of an inch, then you oftentimes have problems with wasps using the houses. So you want to be smaller than an inch. Um, and no, don't mount them on trees. They'll never be used. And I think it's because you get predators that will run up and down the tree and feed on bats like raccoons. And you can install bat houses anytime. That in the in the fall is a good time, so that maybe then when the bats come back the following spring, they might be used.
Great. I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat. That's a great presentation and for sharing all of your knowledge. I want to thank everybody for attending. We'd love to get your feedback. And if you need those CE credits, we need your license numbers. And the DPR credit asks you to take a quick 10-question quiz. And the right link is in the chat. So please check that out and go to that. There are also additional resources on our website that were recommended by Austin and Rachel to check out. There's a couple of articles that they've recommended, plus a couple of videos, including one on how habitat increases birds' pest control services in walnuts. And we will hope to see you at our next webinar, January 14th. Thank you so much for attending.